So I'll share a bit about my story and my journey with PSC. My name is Jessica, and as you can see on the slides, there are a few pictures of me at different points in my life. One was of a few months before transplant. I'm with my niece and nephew. I'm obviously very jaundiced. The middle is of me this past January in New York City as a healthy 3-year post-transplant patient. And the third is of my donor, Palma, and I on our 1-year liver transplant anniversary. I was diagnosed with primary sclerosing cholangitis in 2009 when I was 25 years old, and I was diagnosed by Dr. Hirschfield. My symptoms began when I started to feel incredibly itchy on my hands and my feet. The itch was unrelenting and it was very distracting. And at first I thought that I had caught some sort of a rash from a yoga mat at the gym, so I began taking antihistamines. When that treatment didn't help, I followed up at a walk-in clinic and they gave me a prescription for antihistamines. Unfortunately, these did not ease the discomfort either. And during this time, I began to lose weight rapidly as well. I had no appetite and I felt nauseous more often than not. Over the next few months, I had many visits to the emergency room and was even told I had scabies, which I did not, to try and explain the itch. And I became increasingly frustrated. And finally, at one of the trips to the ER, they decided to take some blood, realized that my liver function tests were a bit elevated, and looked at my gallbladder for the reason. And finally, the radiologist recognized that I was actually suffering from something more serious than an inflamed gallbladder, and I was sent to hepatology. At this point in my life, I was 25 years old. I had never had so much as a cavity, and I was very afraid. Although Dr. Hirschfield was incredibly understanding and thorough in explaining my diagnosis of PSC, it was too much for me to comprehend all at once, and I could only focus on how much my life was going to change and the fact that a liver transplant would likely be in my future. It was incredibly overwhelming for both me and my loved ones. I leaned a lot, on my family and friends for support during this time. I took a break from university and I began a therapy to help me to learn how to cope with my anxiety about having PSC. I was also treated for the itch and subsequently for the acute cholangitis that had been the cause for all my weight loss and nausea. Over time, as I started to recover physically, I was also able to come to better terms with my diagnosis. All I knew for sure was that with this disease, it would be an unpredictable progression. For the next 11 years, the years between diagnosis and transplant, I experienced all kinds of ups and downs. Life was wonderful. It was also scary, and it was sometimes very hard. Having an autoimmune disease can be like that. I had periods of health where my PSC I had periods of health, and then I had periods where my PSC would flare up. I ran a half marathon. I met my husband. I started my career. I founded a charity. I moved provinces, traveled, and had many months and years where PSC was quiet and lived in the back of my mind. I also had times where I wrestled with it both physically and emotionally. I suffered from acute cholangitis numerous times and would be treated with Cipro. Sometimes I would end up in the hospital for a few days on an IV to deal with my biliary infections. There were a few times when biliary stones showed up on my yearly MRIs and ERCPs were done to help open my ducts so that the stones could pass. I developed pancreatitis after one of those scopes and spent several months off of work because of it. Over the years, my color began to worsen and jaundice set in, first a tinge and then very deeply. It made me incredibly self-conscious in public and especially at my job. I had many run-ins outside of my specialists with physicians who were unfamiliar with my condition. And oftentimes I was more familiar with what was going on in my body than they were. It is important in these times to advocate for yourself. I have had instances where doctors wanted to do surgeries or treatments on me that were unnecessary and unsafe. I once had an ER doctor who thought my issue was not PSC, but simply a gallbladder that needed to be removed and was ready to wheel me into the OR. I have had other doctors ask me to interpret my own results. My insistence that they speak to my hepatology team before treating me has prevented a few near disasters, so I encourage you to do the same. Your hepatologists and transplant physicians are only one phone call away. Please encourage those treating you to connect. PSC and I had a complicated relationship. Sometimes we got along just fine, and other times we were worst enemies. I had to learn to live my life fully, but to accept and make space for my condition. I had to learn how to make my mental health a priority and would continue therapy throughout my journey to transplant, and I still do. Financially, I realized that I would have periods where I may need to take extra sick days or time off work. Sharing with the Human Resources Department was helpful in navigating that. I also encourage PSC patients to keep savings accounts for times when income may be affected. I began to understand how to listen to my body. I was a young woman who loved being social. Sometimes I had to sit out for a night with the girls or a concert in order to allow my body to rest. It was not, and is still not, always easy, but it was necessary for me to take care of myself in order to feel my best. On those days, lots of sleep, a movie, and a cup of tea would be my medicine. I recommend anyone who deals with chronic illness have a few key support people in their life who they can be honest with about how they're feeling, someone to share the weight because it can be overwhelming to hold onto alone. I've had a few mentors over the years who were further along than I was in their PSC journey. One friend in particular reminded me to make sure that I still take care of the rest of my body. Don't forget to do regular dental visits, mammograms, and physicals. We PSC patients can sometimes be overwhelmed by taking care of our liver health, and it can be easy to neglect other parts of our health care. I also found that to be valuable and important advice. Life can be full of incredible lessons, self-discovery, new perspectives, and newfound strengths. Living with primary sclerosing cholangitis wasn't all scary and bad. It was simply a part of my journey. My health continued on with the expected ups and downs until 2019, when I became very sick very fast. I had decided, along with Dr. Hirschfield, in October of 2019, that it was time for me to begin evaluation for transplant. Thankfully, I was well on my way through the testing process when in late November, I became acutely ill and was rushed to the hospital by ambulance. It was at that point that it became clear my need for transplant was more urgent than initially anticipated. I had been aware for a while that transplant was in the cards for me. I just didn't think I was ready because I was doing pretty well. I was still working and socializing, generally living a pretty full life. But it wasn't until that ambulance ride that I really realized how sick I was. I was extremely jaundiced. I developed ascites, and 7 liters of fluid were being drained from my belly every 2 weeks. I slept most of the time, and when I wasn't sleeping, I was exhausted. I had muscle wasting at that point and had not menstruated in months. My body was shutting down. To my great surprise, the fear changed from the fear that I would need a transplant to the fear that I would not get one in time. In February of 2020, my cousin Palma donated a portion of her liver to me. Since finding out it was time for transplant, she had been sure that she wanted to donate to me and never wavered for a second. Even though she had 2 beautiful young children at home, she really wanted to be the one to give me a piece of her liver. After a few weeks of testing, we found out she was a match, and I have never been through such a broad range of emotions as I was in that moment. I still struggle to put it all into words today. Grateful, of course, relieved, ecstatic for the chance at a healthy life, scared for surgery, and guilty that someone that I loved was going to be putting themselves through this for me. But gratitude was at the forefront, and it would only grow from there. The love I feel for Palma cannot be articulated. She saved my life. The transplant went off without a hitch. Palma was taken into the OR early in the morning, and I a few hours later. It was a difficult recovery, but not nearly as difficult as I had imagined in my mind. I felt better physically from the moment I opened my eyes. I was overcome by appreciation that I had for Palma, my surgeons, doctors, nurses, the porters at TGH, the custodians, PSC and transplant researchers and scientists, my husband, my family, my friends, and the entire PSC community. It takes a lot of people to make a successful transplant happen, and I felt deep appreciation for every single one of them. I still do. Primary sclerosing cholangitis is a very scary diagnosis. It brings with it endless uncertainty. There's not a lot we can control when we're diagnosed with such a tricky condition. We don't know what course it will take for us, and all experiences seem to be very different from patient to patient. All we can control is our reaction to it. I'm not an expert at that, but I am better than I used to be, and I'm always trying. One thing I do know about the PSC journey and living with it is that I'm not alone. There are many who have been there before, many who are going through it now, and there's comfort in that. And as we, the patients, and the doctors who work tirelessly with us can come together, we can hopefully uncover more ways to navigate and thrive while living with autoimmune liver disease. Thank you so much for your time.